really coming to appreciate the power of a future horizon, and that spending time in it, more than just saying, hey, what are our forecasts, but really immersing in this learning process can bring about, I promise, powerful insights that are needed and essential.
Welcome everyone to Work 2.0 podcast. Today we have with us Marc Johnson and a brief bio. So Marc is a co-founder for the strategy and innovation management consultancy Innosight with Clayton Christensen in 2000. Innosight was acquired by Huron Consulting Group in 2017. He is the author of previous books Transformation and Reinvent Your Business Model, and the McKinsey award-winning Harvard Business Review article, Reinventing Your Business Model. So Marc lives in Belmont, Massachusetts. So with that, Marc, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Vishal. It's good to be here.
Awesome. So before we get to the meaty stuff, that's the book right there. Let's talk about your journey. Like, what brought you to this point?
Well, I think a whole host of things came together. I grew up wanting to fly, and uh, that led me to the Naval Academy trying to be a pilot and becoming an aerospace engineer. Uh, at the academy, my eyes didn't stay 20/20, so I didn't end up flying, but I went into the nuclear power program. So I had a full dose of engineering, both in school, but also in my Navy career. I think the interest in aviation and engineering led me towards innovation. Um, and then I would add another piece to this personally. So that my dad's was ex-military, and so influenced me a great deal towards wanting to go, wanting to go to the academy and the military, and being interested, I think, in engineering and all of that. My mom was an opera singer, so she was an artist, a full-fledged artist, and her creativity, while it didn't lend itself to me in terms of music, I think the upbringing with two parents that had this sort of engineering, mathematical mindset with a more artistic mindset cultivated in me, an interest in innovation, and tying that, the creative pieces of innovation, but also the engineering pieces that I think come with it, and that led to the work and strategy and everything else. So I ended up at Harvard Business School, met Clay Christensen of the Harvard Business School of Innovators Dilemma fame. After I finished school, we decided to do further work together. That led to us in co-founding Innosight together in January of 2000. And it was all around this notion of, how do you manage innovation? How do you address disruptive innovation, both as a threat but also an opportunity? And in the work of trying to understand innovation, it led to the realization you needed to tie it to long-term thinking and strategy to be able, especially in those breakthrough types of growth innovation efforts. And so that put us into the world of strategy, and then it led to thinking about leadership. So bringing that all together has sort of led me where I am today, and the reason I wrote the book Lead from the Future, which is really trying to think about those disciplines of leadership and strategy and innovation and how they come together. So I did that pretty quickly, but that is all the way back what I think has led me in a minute or less to why I'm here today.
That's awesome, and thank you for walking us through the journey. So, for our listeners and viewers, what is Innosight? If you can just walk us through the typical day to day and what the company does today.
Sure. Well, Innosight is a strategy and innovation management consulting firm. We were acquired by Huron Consulting, which is focused mostly on healthcare delivery and higher education. They acquired us in 2017. But our firm, our practice remains an independent group, that we're focused on how companies, large and small, can navigate their way through, the today, the here and now, and into the future, and really own their future, recognizing that oftentimes the future is not a linear path from today. That there are points of inflection, there's changes, there's disruptions So how do you navigate the path of disruption to own your future and really continue to drive top line growth? And I would say, as we deal with this COVID crisis, this importance to be able to look into the future, to own your future, has become more important than ever. But that's what we do at Innosight. We really try to help companies with the ability to define growth strategies, not just in the short term, but the long term. How do they think about developing opportunities the right way that go beyond the core, again, in the spirit of growth? And then how do they drive capabilities as an organization to be able to build a culture that can be more innovative and that can set up the right leadership culture and larger culture to help nurture innovation opportunities along the way?
Interesting. I think I was always curious to understand about InnoSight's. I think you guys came in 2000, as you rightly said. It was it was an interesting time to begin to start talking about innovation. Like, walk us through the initial days of this firm when everyone is panicking about. I think Y2K was the talk of the town during that time. That let's start something innovation. Like, what, walk us through some of those struggles.
Well, you're absolutely right, Vishal. I mean, it was a challenging time. Things started well in January of 2000, and then we had the whole dot-com bubble, and then you had 9/11 a year later. So it was very difficult times for us as well as everybody else. And there was a lot of uncertainty. So a lot of companies that came to us was trying to understand even more so how they might get disrupted, how they would need to make sure to be ready to innovate to get through the crisis. And when we started as a company, we were more focused on trying to help with a language. How do you build a common language about the management of innovation? It's not just innovation as a blank word, but there's sustaining innovation, there's disruptive innovation. There's innovation that sustains the core business, but there's new and different innovation that can be an opportunity to disrupt industries, and how do you manage both? So we really started as a firm more in the, if you will, the executive education side, more of the teaching side. We did a lot of collaborative things with Harvard Business School, and we helped companies we even did some conferences. So we were developing case studies for companies. And as we moved along, we realized that there were opportunities to actually more work like a traditional consulting firm and actually conduct with teams a process by which they could problem solve, to identify opportunity, to be able to design the opportunity, to develop it, to build a business model around these opportunities, and then be able to figure out what's the right way to learn. So it's interesting, our own experience, and I think this is the experience of many companies, whether you're startup or existing, is some things you can do deliberately. You can think about, these are what we intend to do. It's a deliberate strategy, but there are other things that happen emergently. And we certainly had in those early days some emergent opportunities that we would have never foreseen, such as the government of Singapore in 2002 asking for our help to help them as a city state nation to begin to think about how they could apply disruptive innovation to allow for more entrepreneurial activity in their country and not just depend on the multinationals that come into Singapore. So, yeah, those were very interesting days. And our model evolved from just, like I said, teaching to consulting. And also, our model evolved from just innovation to this importance of going through the right kind of vision and strategy process to really drive the long-term viability or sustainability of an organization.
Interesting. And walk us through your current day to days. Like, what's your typical day look like? Uh, if you can walk us through, what do you do in InnoSight? We'll be back after a short break. This part of the podcast is sponsored by Tao.ai, world's first AI-powered platform to build enterprise success network. Learn more at Tao.ai. Let's go back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one is I do a lot of podcasts these days. I do a lot of webinars, and there's a lot of opportunity with the book. And in fact, again, as you might imagine, a lot of people are asking, how do I not only deal with the crisis, but how do I plan for the
mm,
future? When everyone, I think, is starting to say, boy, this future might not be the way it used to be. To quote the poet Paul Valery, who
mm,
used to say, who literally said, the future's not what it used to be. I think we can
mm,
all say we're living and breathing that now. So that's a big part. But I also have client work, and we work with healthcare companies right now that are doing things that are related to the crisis, as well as dealing with things that are not related to the crisis, and them trying to figure out how do they restart. A company that has medical device business that's taking a big hit because there's no elective surgery right now. So we're doing consulting both to um, work with companies that are seeing opportunity, important opportunity based on the crisis. Getting schools online that haven't been
mm.
online, and we're also trying to deal with the threats or the immediate pain of businesses being shut off. And how do you change the portfolio? How do you manage through the crisis, from an innovation perspective, not just from a pure, say, cost cutting or operational side of things. So that takes up a decent part of my time as well. And then, I think we work uh, in a combination of both teaching, because all of our
Mm,
work we try to be highly collaborative, with the client teams that we work with, because we want to try to not just problem solve together, but we want to transfer capability. We want to transfer this language, and we want to transfer skills and know how, so that their organization can continue on without us. In particular, because much of our work is with innovation teams who have a lot of smart people who are very capable to begin with, and our our objective is really just to be additive to what they're already doing.
interesting. And so now let's get to the meat of the stuff. Lead from the future. So tell us the journey. Why write this book?
Well, so I think the reason that I decided to write the book is because we would try to embark with companies, with clients so often, and trying to help them get beyond their core to try to come up with a breakthrough growth initiative, to try to change their business model based on a market changing, or maybe even within their market, having to make some big fundamental changes. And these transformative growth efforts, they get started, but then as time went on, if there was any issues that happened with the core, or the growth initiative wasn't moving along at the pace that executives expected, funding would get cut.
Mm,
Or if the core business just got in trouble, funding would get cut. Or there would be just not the commitment, even from the start, to be able to kind of see these efforts through, where they're not as predictable and not as um, easy to be aware of where they're going to go as it is with operating and executing the traditional business. There's more of a learning component. There's more of a risk management piece of it. And so we come to the realization that if we didn't think about bringing the future alive, being able to do more than just a vision statement, but actually start to peer into the future, to understand the environment and the implications of that, and where there are opportunities, especially that could be missed if you didn't start now with these initiatives. If we didn't try to think long term and develop this vision and this future back way of looking, then these innovation efforts, these breakthrough innovation, these disruptive innovation efforts were not getting traction. So the book is really an effort, more than an effort. I think we succeeded in it, in trying to show very clearly how you can create a vision, translate it to strategy, and then that strategy becomes the underpinning of developing both core innovation, but also breakthrough innovation, transformative innovation efforts, and giving them a much better chance of developing and succeeding in the organization versus the way we had done it without thinking about leading from the future and being more forward looking that starts with the top team to do that.
Interesting. I think fair point. So, by the way, good book, interesting read for sure to our listeners and viewers. And I think one of the things that I felt when I was reading this book. So I we come from the data science world, so very analytical, predicting what's going on, sort of prescriptive, predictive analytics. And when you come from that mindset and you read this book, it gives you kind of a pause, right? It gives you that, okay, maybe relax and think about those strategies, because we are so attuned to understanding the human or a customer behavior, and from that predicting the new future or predicting the future. And I think you talked about that phenomenon as present forward, right? So if we compare that with, say, future back, like how do you uh, comply between these two ideologies? Like, we are very like data centric, and the world is jumping to get sort of more analytical, and then you're saying, okay, maybe we should look from the future back what's going on.
No, it's another great question. Let me just say, being present forward, which means sort of taking the existing base of knowledge and data, both current data and past data, and using that uh, to move forward in time is essential for any established institution or company. And it's going to be 90%, 80 to 90% of anybody's effort. It's the predominant mode. And and the better we get at data management and analytics, the better we can plan forward and move product development and people development and all of those things in the right way. So it's a critical component to what institutions and individuals need to do. What I'm saying with future back, however, is data is really only a reflection of the past. It's not really,
Mm.
you don't get data from the future. And yes, you can use data to put predictive models in place and to build theory, but a lot of what happens in the future is about assumptions. It's about as much an art as a science, and to try to say, okay, well, we have a set of trends. How are these trends coming together? And how will they come together, say 5 to 10 years out, which will have implications for opportunities that we might be able to develop? And what would those opportunities start to look like? That can't really be, that has some data and analytic component to it, but it has a large piece that has to do with the more right brain creative design piece of envisioning what things could be and should be as opposed to what they are. And so in order to think about what things are around the corner that you don't see today and to be able to anticipate them, you have to spend time in the future, and you can't do that in an analytical way completely because, as I said, there's just too many unknowns. So you have to do it in more of a debate and discussion, evolve a point of view kind of way. Think about these assumptions that you want to make, and that you then want to figure out how you bring those back to the present to test them through a set of experiments that move you towards that intended future view and future vision. And that's all what future back is about. It's both a way of thinking, which is, how do you think holistically? How do you think clean sheet, zero base? Don't let today's orthodoxies and structure, at least for the moment, impede how things could be and should be. How do you take as a process and walk that future back literally? So imagine what things could be in 2030. What does that
Mm.
mean in terms of what business and capability wise you would need to have in 2027 to meet that intention? And then you just keep working it back. The final piece about it is, in this future back way, it's not give me the data and the information and I'll make a decision and take action, and then we keep moving on. This is about an iterative loop. It's about exploring, envisioning, learning, discovering what worked, what didn't, how do I adjust my vision and strategy, how do I adjust the initiatives that I'm going toward. So it's a messier, more creative, more iterative, 3 steps forward, a step back kind of process. But we have found if you can get leadership and other teams to spend 10%, maybe up to 20% of their time in this mode, they will develop insights and a perspective that will help all the things they're doing today in this present forward mode.
We'll be back after a short break. This part of the podcast is sponsored by Tao.ai, world's first AI-powered platform to build enterprise success network. Learn more at Tao.ai. Let's go back. Interesting. And I think one thing that when I was reading the book, one story that really came out from my personal experience. So it's one of the Fortune 100 company. They recently hired basically a sales strategy head for the company, and his job. This is the only one in million story that I have heard, which actually kind of resonate with what this book is all about. So he said that, hey, I don't want you to make my sales guys efficient. I want you to just ignore whatever we have and build something from ground up, because we may be missing out. Because sure, I can give like 2% improvement with tweaks here and there, but what I want to figure out, if there are undercurrents happening that are transforming the organization that I don't have a vision with, and maybe you can just go on this ride and basically look back from your vantage point. What do you see? If there are any holes that we can fix, and if there's any strategy. And he ended up sort of redefining one of their pricing strategy, which actually generates substantial revenue for this particular company. But that, I think, and his, so that was a good part, right? But then 80% of his conversation was bickering, right? My leaders were not cooperating with me. People were not interacting with me because they want to meet their sales quota, right? They're not looking for throwing outside everything outside the window. So what would you tell to this guy? Like, how would, if there are other who are not that successful in pushing this idea forward, what do you suggest to these guys that they should do to get this idea out, and so they can execute something?
Yeah, no, it's another great question. Well, I think one thing is, back to starting with language. So much of what creates resistance is there's there are biases, right? They're just intrinsic biases about the future can't really be predicted. It's a fool's errand. Nobody has a crystal ball. Um, uh, it's not going to do anything for the next number of quarters, as you said. Um, we just don't have time. Let's focus on the things that are more tangible and we have time for. So what we found is you have to start with this language of present forward versus future back. You have to make the case why long-term thinking really matters. And as you probably saw in the book, one of the examples I give, or data for that matter that I give, is long-term shareholder return,
Mm,
versus margin expansion, and showing there's no correlation in the long term with companies that keep trying to improve their margins at the expense of the top line versus long-term shareholder return versus revenue growth has a perfect correlation. So over the long term, over the 8-year period of which this was the time frame for these top 20 market cap companies, there was absolutely, without a shadow of doubt, proof that, back to making the case that from a financial point of view, from a total shareholder return point of view, the companies that are thinking long term, that are driving long term revenue growth and not worried about the immediate term of keep driving out margin, are the ones that sustain and the ones that really create value. So I think you got to build this language about making the case, showing also there's a huge gap in companies thinking, and they don't really have a measurement for it, which is, what is that opportunity out there? What is that opportunity cost that is occurring because you haven't been able to think about the possibility that there is something to do beyond what you're doing now? that can create whole new growth. So it's more about the opportunity than the threat out in the future. There's certainly threats, and to your point, early signals and warning signs. So anyway, I think you have to make the case and give examples and use something like present forward and future back and say, future back is not an 80% of your time, or it's not even a 50-50. It's how can you carve out a little bit of time and dedicate that time and think about it in the right way, use this right kind of learning process, which is not an operate and execute type of process. And by the way, this can include functions as well. It doesn't have to just be the whole business. It can be HR, it can be the marketing function, it can be even in budgeting. So first, I think you got to build this language. And the second is, I think, if you can create the specifics of how you would actually do it, how do you bring a vision and translate it into a strategy, and then link that to modest experiments today that can mitigate the risk and that cannot take up too much of the resources, again, 10% of the dollars and the people and the management bandwidth, then I think you give an awareness that this is eminently doable and it's not this major distraction or infringement on all of the efforts that are being made toward the core.
Interesting. And I think so when I hear this 10% of you should allocate towards these kind of initiatives, I think one thing that comes to my mind is say many of the companies who are legacy, uh, basically low margin businesses who are basically struggling to get the foothold. If you talk to their executives about R&D budget, right? If you talk to them about that, they're very squeaky that, hey, I have, take automakers for an example. They have this one slingshot opportunity that they can take maybe, and then they are competing for low margin sort of in their respective categories. How does that ideology change from industry to industry, that how much you can flex toward this idea of going future back versus present forward?
Well, I do think one of the things we talk about in the book is once you've looked into the future, um, and you've talked about the environment and trend lines, and you've talked about where's the customer going and what's going to really matter to her, based on the trends and the circumstance, the implications of all that, if you do it right, are either there's a real threat and we have to address it, or it's a moderate threat, or there's this big opportunity that we need to see, or stay the course. We have just too much opportunity already in what we're doing. Um, we we shouldn't be diverting funds away from or time or attention into anything about planting the seeds just because we're on such an amazing growth path with the core. So I think unless you're in that last category, I think this applies to and we would say that's very rare. If you're feeling like you don't have the funds because you're hunkering down on the core, um, because there's trouble or there's challenges, there's there's more the reason you have to begin to try to figure out some way to be in investing for the future. So in terms of industries, I don't think there's anything. The only thing that applies to different industries from our perspective is the time horizon. So a software company, they're far out, sort of what we would call uncomfortable but not unrelatable horizon, maybe only up to 5 years. Whereas a farm company or defense contractor might be past 10 years. They might need to look out 15 more years or more to kind of get past the planning and forecasting horizon. So that's the main way we see differences in industries. What we don't typically find or would recommend against would be thinking that this is something that doesn't apply to us because somewhere we're in our industry state. Um, that means we can't carve that out, because by not carving it out, you're basically saying that you don't have any major or moderate threats down the road to deal with. You don't have any major or moderate opportunities down the road with that you should develop now. Everything from a threat and opportunity side relates to exactly what you're doing now, and therefore just keep R&D keep all your spending and efforts on sustaining this core. And we see that as as I said, a very rare exception. Most companies are facing too much turbulence in the industry, too much of technologies evolving, people are learning, data analytics, all these things are creating really constant change, which makes it highly unlikely that your quote unquote theory of the business is just going to remain indefinitely. In fact, lastly, I'll just say we talk about it in the book, the present forward fallacy, the notion that you
Mm.
can just continue to increment your business indefinitely into the future uh, is it's very dangerous to think that way for all the reasons that I've discussed, and I think everybody understands.
We'll be back after a short break. This part of the podcast is sponsored by Tao.ai, world's first AI-powered platform to build enterprise success network. Learn more at Tao.ai. Let's go back. Interesting. And I definitely want your perspective on on today's times, what's happening, right? But another interesting, say 2 months back, if you look our economy at that point, we were talking about technology disruption. We're talking about AI taking over. We're talking about automation impacting sort of many companies. And then on the technology side, if you see lot of transformative companies, technologies that are emerging, that are going basically they're going undergoing their own S curve disruption, right? They're undergoing their own evolution.
Right.
So basically you are relying on something is happening, but whatever is happening is itself is evolving really rapidly, right? So when you are in those conversation, whenever we talk to any business, they are basically all scratching their head and okay, we don't even know where to evolve, right? We don't know what's going on. So we're just trying to just figure out if there's any stable technology out there. Many companies that are legacy, they're saying we just hold on to it unless there's enough proof point before we jump on board. So what will you tell those companies that if, because it's a pretty interesting time, I think, and your book is very timely from that perspective, because if you don't react, you will lose. Basically, you lose out on the disruptive trends. If you react too quickly, you will be paying the price for disruption that is someone else is doing in its own industry. What would you say would be a better resolve for the companies? Like, what are you seeing from your vantage point?
Yeah, no, I think it's very interesting what you're saying. So when we prescribe this 5 to 10 year horizon in the book, where you spend a lot of time in, the idea is to get out of the noise of the here and now, to be at a
Mm,
place where it's likely that there's points of inflection. It's likely that there could be a disruption. If you go that far out, some form of disruption, technological, what have you. Um, this is clearly a disruption, this pandemic, of an economic proportion. But it's these kind of black swan events or things that just you can't predict off a trend line. And so you look out 5 to 10 years for those, along with trend lines in general, and you take those trend lines and you tie it really importantly to what the customer is trying to get done, so you can see where value is going to go for the customer and therefore how your organization. Now, I set all that up to say, well, this COVID-19 crisis takes all those trends and takes all that disruptive inflection points and moves it way up, moves it up,
mm,
you know, to now, instead of thinking about, oh, we can just kind of think about these technologies in 5 to 10 years, those things for many, many companies and many industries are now part of the 12 to 24 months. They're part of
mm,
the next year and the next 24 months. So what we prescribe is you need the visioning piece more to kind of inspire the organization that, hey, we're going to get through all this noise, and we have a place that we want to go, and we have a purpose, and we have hope, and we have a way to think about what is our, what are the things that are going to really matter to us. Like there are companies we analyzed in terms of what we call the transformation 20 around the world companies, and found that Well, common denominator in their ability to transform is that they were imbued with purpose. Siemens saying that they were really trying to make for a better society. A Danish company called Orsted who said that they wanted to move into more clean energy and to help again better society. So you need that vision piece, but then you need to bring that back to the 12 to 24 months. And that's really going to be the place where you're going to really have these deep conversations about future back. And you're going to have to include scenarios because there's just so much uncertainty about where things are going. But you have to have the same conversation, which is take for a moment and not think about today and think about what could be and should be in that future, because you don't want to extrapolate a linear line to everything being somehow tied to off of exactly how it goes today. There could be discontinuous changes. And so you want to think, what's the environment going to be like in a year from now or in a year and a half, tied off of our vision? What does our organization want to be focused on in terms of the existing, but also the new normal and new opportunities? How do you begin to think about different options that and scenarios in that time, and then begin to then bring that back to today to say, what are our priorities of investment and initiatives? What things do we want to keep doing in the core as investment, but also what are some of the things we need to plan now in order to achieve our 12 to 24 month horizon? For example, we're doing work in higher education, and there's a number of business schools in executive education who are saying, we may never go back to just being in the classroom the way before. We absolutely now need to get online in a way that we've never been online before. Well, you need to do that future back and look at where do you want to be with online learning and education as part of your curriculum in 24 months from now or 18 months from now. And what is that going to look like? Not just get everybody online, but think holistically of all the aspects of what makes the right learning environment. And then how do you walk that back to the pieces of that new system that you need to start building today, so you think again future back and holistically, and you don't try to retrofit the existing in-person classroom paradigm and just put that online. That's what happened with newspapers, by the way, in the very beginning. They
Mm.
just took the newspaper, the printed newspaper, and they just put it online. And that's not really how online news and information has, as we know, ultimately became fundamentally a different business model.
Interesting. So, I think you raise an interesting point about black swan events, right? So now, if we talk about what's happening today, right? So suddenly a black swan event happened, and if you look at, say, investors playbook, right? So many times you say when the turbulent times come, just hold on to your cash, right? So just stop all these projects, all sort of these things, and just make sure the lights are on. Just you basically assess the risk, assess the what's going on, and how much control do you have on the situation, and just go in that strategy duck hole and trying to figure out what's going on. So how would something like future back gets impacted with something like this? Like how would you suggest that, is this the right time, or how would, if I'm a company and I'm seeing this black swan events emerging around me, how would I
Mhm.
read this book?
Well, I think again, it's about doing both present forward and future back. I mean, there clearly are immediate actions and things you have to do to attend to the current crisis. We wrote a book a few years ago that I co-authored called Dual Transformation.
Mm, mm,
I think you have to think about it as a dual transformation. There are going to be a set of things, to your point, you're going to have to make changes to the current organization to be in survival mode. And we would say, it could be cost cutting, but maybe it's not cut costs. Maybe it's more of
mm,
a transformation, thoughtful about how you reposition the core business to remain viable when so many things have changed today or in the next number of months. So think about how you have to change the core, But you also have to think about what are you going to do differently beyond the core as a result of this crisis, and
Mm.
consistent with your vision, your purpose-driven vision to inspire the organization. So how do you also think about building the new and different, and spending some time soon to begin to plan for that and plant seeds for it? Because if you just stay present forward and operate and execute and just deal with the crisis of today and all of this, and you just keep doing that because you say we don't have time for anything else, what happens 12 months from now when your competitors and others and entrepreneurs have been spending 12 months rethinking the new normal, and you've said, well, we don't have time because we've just trying to stay above water? Somehow you have to
Mm.
find the time to do both. And again, maybe it's 80 or 90% of your time is on the core and core transformation, but on a weekly basis, find that 10% or 20 up to 20% of the time to have these conversations as a leadership team about what things in our future tied back to the next 18 to 24 months do we need to be planning for and thinking about now, in addition to the things we're working in the immediate.
Interesting. I think it's a fair point. So if I'm an executive and basically I get it, I get this idea of leading from the future, and somehow my ecosystem or sort of my empowerment network, so to speak, if they are not sold on this idea, what would you suggest I should do? Would be my playbook from your mindset that I should be executing to, because it requires a cultural change for some companies who are not very thoughtful about looking back, and it's exceptionally crucial. I totally agree with you on that. What would you tell to those leaders who are stuck in this present forward and thinking, okay, I just have to be 2% better than the last time, and I'm good there. So what would you tell them?
Well, I think you have to go back to this idea of language, or maybe even more pointed, having a mantra. Um, Satya Nadella, when he took over Microsoft, now it wasn't in a societal crisis like we were, but they were certainly big challenges for Microsoft. And when Satya Nadella took over, um, he just long story short, actually, it was through his wife shared with him a book, and I talk a little bit about this in Lead from the Future. And long story short is what came in Satya's mind was that Microsoft had become a culture of know-it-alls.
Mm,
And he said we need to
mm,
change to a culture of learn-it-alls, right? And that was his whole book on, hit reset and hit refresh. I think, did I get that wrong?
mm,
Uh, I think it's hit refresh, and and I think that's a mantra, uh, and I think it's very consistent with what I would advise today, which is learning's on the other side of innovation, and in and humility's on the other side of learning. And I think one of the first steps is to try to to help the organization move towards a culture of humility and learning that allows them to learn from the future, learn from the moment, and be able to pivot and adjust quickly. When there's all this kind of disruption and churn, we talk about orgs. You mentioned the automotive industry. When we worked with automotive clients, and they said, "Well, we've got all these things coming at us: electrification,
mm,
where the
mm,
internal combustion engine might go away, um, automation, autonomous vehicles, connectivity, which can change the whole paradigm of how, what really is a car and how connected it is with, Internet of Things and all of that, and big data and, artificial intelligence is part of autonomy. We don't know what the future is going to hold, and that's absolutely true. But you can set a vision and direction, and what you need to do to get toward that vision is the company that learns the fastest and be able to learn from the environment, learn from themselves, and adjust for it is the ones that are going to be the most successful, because nobody does have a crystal ball. So I'd say the same thing here is, how do you get an organization, a culture, to embrace, what Peter Senge talked about in the early 90s, the fifth discipline, to become a true learning
mm,
organization, to be able to not just say, give me the facts and data and make decisions, but how can we explore? How can we debate and discuss and have this sort of more foresight type of conversation that then leads to envisioning, to imagine and to be able to develop, and then leads to discovery, test, and learn. The process should be ongoing. You have a vision. In the next 18 to 24 months, you have scenarios and points of view about what things you need to be investing in now. And then you have a bunch of things you are investing in now, both for the short term and the midterm. You've got to use learning to continue to pivot on, okay, what does the information and the insights and experience tell us about changes or shaping of our vision? How do we adjust our scenarios in the way we think about the 18 to 24 month set of options? And how do we adjust what we prioritize as initiatives? It can't be a one and done exercise. So often, oh, we do strategy once a year, strategic planning, or we'll do a major strategic review once every 5 years. It can't be that way anymore. The world's moving too fast, and especially now it's at lightning speed. You have to constantly be revisiting and learning from the environment and encouraging, like Satya Nadella, for an organization to be an organization of learn-it-alls, not know-it-alls.
Interesting. And about the book. So, if describe us the typical reader that you wrote this book for.
Well, to be honest, I had a ambitious goal for the audience because, first, let me say, and then I could maybe dissect down to the individual reader. The audience is not just for business people, executives, managers, etc. This pertains to government and to nonprofits, to the military, to even faith-based institutions. I just think in our world, even well before the COVID-19 crisis, we've become very short-sighted. We've become very much here and now oriented. Most organizations are not forward-looking, or at least not forward-looking enough. And I think it's a real pathology. It's a real dilemma. It's a real crisis, even before the COVID crisis, because it's risking the stewardship, the longevity of organizations, and to keep them thriving and growing. So the audience, generally speaking, is for leaders well beyond the business leadership. Within the business leadership, I think it applies to the top team. I think it applies not just for the chief strategy officer, but the head of HR, the head of marketing, all of the team, I think, needs to be thinking and appreciating the power of thinking about the future and planning for it. And the organization itself, the individuals that are running innovation teams or they're within a function, even for themselves, being able to appreciate, that visionary thinking isn't some mystical thing that only some of these famous people who are considered visionaries can do. That there is a way of thinking in a process, and that's what we lay out in Lead from the Future, that can help you both personally and help you within your function or help you within your business unit or your division or for the enterprise.
Interesting.
It's a
And
pretty ambitious scope of audience. So
okay, nice. And so you spoke about visionary organization. Like, what is a visionary organization? What would you call an organization as a visionary organization?
I think a visionary organization is one that has a narrative about its future horizon in terms of what it wants to be and what it wants to become and what it should become, how it can shape the future. And I put this very explicitly in the book, that a visionary organization isn't an organization that has a vision statement, that's a couple sentences that it did as part of a vision and mission uh, defining, to exercise. A visionary organization really has a clear sighted view of what the organization and its core business, its future businesses come together as a system, what that should look like to best seize the opportunity for how things in the future are going to look like. And it has an ability to marshal, or it has an ability to align people behind that. It's focused on the narrative, it's focused on the purpose that's in that vision narrative. It aligns people behind it. Um, a visionary organization is very, as I said, very open to learning, because it's using what it learns to continue to adjust its vision and adjust what it needs to do to get there. And that is what I think is a visionary organization, that it's constantly thriving and adjusting and evolving, and changing in the right ways, also sticking to its true principles and protecting the core business at the same time. So that's to me a visionary organization. And as you're pointing out, it doesn't have to just be within one individual. It can be embedded in the culture of the organization if it will embrace future back thinking and embrace future back process as a way to make vision come to life and make it practical in terms of day-to-day decision making.
Interesting. And while during the process of writing this book, what are some of the myths that you end up sort of uncovering when it comes to, so from lead from the future? What are some of the myths that you saw that businesses who could use this are on the fence, that you think that they could address?
Well, I think, the first and foremost myth is, that the future, futuring like this, which is more than just futuring, right? Because you're not just saying, hey, this is what we see as these top 10 trends. You're actually proactively defining your future state, what you look like as a enterprise in that. But I think there's a huge bias,
Mm,
against looking out 5 to 10 years, that it's not practical, that it's a fool's errand. Nobody has a crystal ball. So and I think it's a myth and a misconception. I think people think in order to make conversations around the future constructive, you have to be definitive. And it's not about certainty, and it's not about creating a photograph of the 5 to 10 year horizon. It's about creating an impressionist painting. It's about creating a perspective. And so I think the first myth is as much a misunderstanding about what does it mean to manage the future. And if we could get the right language and the right approach, and just start to have conversations about the future as teams, not just as individuals. I know just from the experience of having done this for the last 10 plus years in our 20-year um, time as Innosight, that they will be powerful and productive conversations, and that they will lead to new insights. So to me, that's the number one myth to get over. I mean, the other, I think, myth is that you don't have time for it. And we've talked a lot
mm,
about that. You cannot get stuck in the tyranny of the urgent, which companies are facing all the time because there's just more and more coming at them, right? As managers, as leaders. So there's got to be a way to prioritize and say, this will never be as urgent as the next 12 months, or what things have to happen, to continue to sustain and operate and execute the business. But it doesn't mean that it's any less vital. It may not be as urgent, but we got to get over the myth that, I think, the urgent things are what we need to take our time at, spend our time on. We need to as
mm,
much get past that and spend our time on what things are vital. And just from just knowing how many companies are struggling to drive top line growth in the long term and develop new growth platforms, you can see they are not spending time on this vital discussion about the future and future opportunities. So you got to get that myth around time management, I think, as another big problem. Um, and then I guess, what I would probably say as a last myth is we got to get past the present forward fallacy, which is,
mm,
oh, we can go into the future. We'll take what we have today and we'll just extrapolate that into the future. And we got to get past the myth that this notion that somehow the future is going to be a straight line. We have to be able to get out of our orthodoxies and clean sheet and think more as a design thinker to be able to make the future planning done in the right way.
Awesome, and thank you for so much for walking us through this book. I think it was pretty nice, and thank you for helping us understand the lead from the future construct in an organization. So now we are at the tail end of the conversation, and I want to spend a few minutes on your journey, if I may. So
Sure.
we ask all of our guests to talk about some of the qualities that really help them stay where they are today. Like, what would you attribute your success to? Which qualities has really helped you become what you are today? So what would you attribute those qualities?
Well, one that I think shouldn't be a surprise since we talked about it quite a bit, and I said it was so tightly tied to innovation, is learning. I've been a student of learning, and I'm not saying I have the mastery of it, but I have had a passion for it, and I've really valued it, and I feel like individual and organizational learning is more critical than ever. And I think what I would attribute to my success, and Innosight's success, I believe, is having this learning openness, to be explicit about the learning process, and know what is learning and what's not, and what are all the dimensions of the kinds of learning. Learning from lessons learned versus learning from best practices and different problem solving modes, and embracing that learning as a discipline. And then also recognizing, and this is one of Innosight's literally stated values, is humility. That the humility piece is
Mm,
critical to be able to learn and to be in the right listening mode and to learn from the right people. And so I think learning is perhaps number one for me, and embracing it and trying to be as good at it as running it as an individual in a process as I can be. And then I also think communications has
mm,
been huge. Communications in the sense that it can enable learning because you reach out and you talk to people, and you listen to them, and you try to understand them, and you try to teach in the right way. And so I think learning with teaching, and then I guess finally, all of that, I think this is the entrepreneurial part in me, and kind of continuing to try to help and grow Insight, is taking initiative, thinking about,
mm,
um, what can I start and instigate by myself. Who can I reach out to and be able to think could give me some valuable insight or information, or could be a mentor, could be a helper, and not wait for them to come to me, but me go to them. And
mm,
there's always that feeling like being vulnerable, like ego sets in and says, well, I should have people that come to me and ask me questions. But I have found being proactive and asking others questions and being good, again, in that learning mode and communicating, all then leads to helping me build not just knowledge, but trying to build, more importantly, I think, wisdom, um, about about what really kind of drives success. What are those principles? And I think that comes through these elements that I talked about.
awesome, and thank you so much for sharing those with us. So one more thing that we ask our guests to share some of their favorite reads for our listeners and viewers. Like, can you share some of your favorite reads with us?
Yeah, well, one, I'll give you kind of two flavors. One, I've enjoyed, just because I'm so much now in the space of this, anything and everything about the future. So, I maybe this is a plug for my good friend and colleague Rita McGrath in her book Seeing Around Corners, which I think our books are very complementary, and you get the same idea, with the title Seeing Around Corners. Um,
Mm,
and then I've had some fun books, but along the serious line. I like historical. Um, I like to have reads that are historical biographies and historical events. So I've read the latest book by Ron Chernow on Ulysses S. Grant. Still actually reading it, and then Chernobyl. Uh,
mm.
I saw the miniseries, but my daughter gave me the book, and I'm just enthralled. Can't get enough of it. So that's kind of a very eclectic combination, but that's at least what I've recently read and been reading.
Thank you so much on sharing those reads. So, last but not the least, if you want something that our listeners and viewers could take away from this conversation, what would that be? Like, what would be your closing remark to our listeners and viewers?
I think the closing remark is that um, being able to put yourself into a future horizon and engage in a set of conversations that are past just facts and data, um, and doing it in a collaborative way to go from foresight, to insight to action. By the way, that's from my other good friend Bob Johansson, who runs the Institute for the Future. Talks about it that way, but it's about really coming to appreciate the power of a future horizon, and that spending time in it, more than just saying, hey, what are our forecasts, but really immersing in this learning process, can bring about, I promise, powerful insights that are needed and essential as to be complementary with the insights that come from facts and data in present forward mode. You got to bring these together, and we need to put this in the lexicon, and we'll have much more success in planting the future generations of people and companies and society as a whole.
With that, thank you so much, Mark, and to our listeners and viewers. Do check out the book. Definitely, I gave it a read. It's definitely a good book, and it's I think it's a good refresher. It's a good strategy book for a quick read to understand what's going on, what they should do, and it's I think. When I was reading that, I was getting this feeling of spending 5 hours on myself, right? So it's pretty much it's like spending some time for the organization, looking back what's going on, and you're not just. I think, and you rightly said, it's the present forward fallacy that we many times we just it's like a uh, keep rolling the wheel, and we lose track of what the mission and what's the broader picture that we're trying to solve. And it's definitely a good read. And with that, thank you so much, Mark, for your time, and wish you nothing but success on the book. And I will post the link for the book on the description to our listeners and viewers. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Vishal. Been great to be here.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on a